Welcome back. You're watching continuous coverage here on WION. World is one of Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US, and we are counting down to the much-anticipated Howdy Modi event in Houston, Texas. It's 6:30 p.m. India time, or 1300 GMT, and it's 8 in the morning in Houston, where people have begun queuing up at the NRG Stadium as excitement builds up to the much-anticipated event called Howdy Modi. And as we watch these latest visuals coming to you from the venue of that much-anticipated address by Prime Minister Modi, let me take this opportunity to welcome another of my guests, Professor Harsh V. Pant, who is the head of ORF's Strategic Studies Program. Thank you for joining us on WION World. Appreciate it. And as we watch these visuals from outside and inside the NRG Stadium in Houston, let me go to my guest, Professor Pant, and ask him for his views on the Trump-Modi bromance and how that might play out in the hours ahead as we count down to the much-anticipated big-ticket event in Houston, Texas.
Well, this relationship has been, we have been watching this relationship with great anticipation, sometimes with a degree of, there was a lot of expectation to begin with. And I think most of the times, Mr. Modi and whenever Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump, they have met, we have found that they have met the expectations that many have had, sometimes confounded the detractors even. So what we are looking at today is, there are reports of Mr. Trump speaking himself, so we would be hearing very carefully what he has to say.
Sure.
But also probably, there have been discussions around themes which have been negative over the last few weeks and months.
Right.
So there was, whether it's trade, whether it's Kashmir, there have been a lot of negative reportage on that. So one hopes that a lot of that would be put to rest. One hopes that a more forward-looking positive agenda will come out, as the Prime Minister has laid out during his, as he went into the US, and in fact in his first day itself, the way he has reached out to the US investors, to the energy sector. I think what perhaps would be very thrilling for a lot of people would be to see two leaders of these two great democracies coming together, doing an event of a kind which doesn't really happen very many times.
Absolutely.
Not many leaders do that.
Sure.
So clearly, it's an interesting phase in a relationship that is doing so well already, and I think Mr. Trump has done. And Mr. Modi himself has invested a lot in this.
Absolutely.
And despite all the sort of irritants that we have seen in the recent past, the relationship has actually been quite robust.
Absolutely. A one-of-a-kind event, says Professor Pant. Ambassador Singh, you wanted to come in on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to, when you spoke about Trump-Modi bromance, I just wanted to recall for you that in 2014, when our Prime Minister Modi was campaigning to be Prime Minister, one of the slogans was "Ab ki baar Modi Sarkar." And in 2016, when President Trump was campaigning for president, one group of Indian Americans had come out in support of him when he was not getting outside support in any meaningful way, and they had also raised funds for his campaign. And at that time, one of the campaign videos he had put out was "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar." So, but another thing you would note that there was a period when perhaps there was a gap in terms of meetings between the Indian Prime Minister and the US President under President Trump. But in the last few months, they met in June in Osaka at the time of the G20 summit. They met in August in Biarritz in France at the time of the G7 summit. They're going to be together at this event, and they're going to be meeting again in New York on the 24th of September. Now, this is very unusual for the US president to have so many frequent meetings with any leader, including an Indian leader.
Sure.
So again, I think it's a signal to the comfort level that President Trump has in this relationship with the Indian Prime Minister, and the value he's attaching to the India relationship. Soon after getting elected, I recall in 2016, the Indian Prime Minister was among the first heads of state government he had spoken to, and also after his inauguration. And when the Indian Prime Minister had visited in June 2017, it was a very, very successful visit.
Right.
So clearly this is a relationship that President Trump himself has attached some importance to. Although, as I said, there are frictions on trade, that has to be addressed. Some of President Trump's comments have not gone down well in India, including some of his comments specifically referring to the Indian Prime Minister. But if you look at the series of steps in the last few months and their meetings and the manner in which they have interacted with each other, you see visuals of the bonhomie between them when they met in Biarritz.
Right.
So clearly there is a certain comfort level. But I think both see value to themselves from this partnership and to the countries they represent.
Indeed. And as we watch these latest visuals from inside the NRG Stadium in Houston, Texas, I want to take a moment to ask a question to both my guests, Ambassador Singh and Professor Pant. Ambassador Singh, you will bear me out when I say that diplomacy is also about optics and managing the optics. Now, there are two streams of thought or schools of thought. One which says this event enjoys bipartisan support in the U.S. domestic politics. By that they mean, and they say, that Republicans and Democrats both will be represented at the Howdy Modi event in Houston, Texas, number one. Number two, at the same time, this event comes a few months before the 2020 U.S. elections. Your thoughts on the optics of the event per se from the perspective of how it might play out domestically in the U.S.? Ambassador Singh.
First, I would say whether or not there is a domestic political dimension, if the U.S. president is going to be present at an event, you welcome that.
Sure.
Even if it is 1 week before the elections. Because he is not just representing himself or his party, he is also representing the United States. And that sends a signal to the U.S. system and globally. Because although the India-U.S. relationship is consolidating significantly, even today, there are large numbers of people in the U.S., in the U.S. administration, in the bureaucracy and outside who question the value of the relationship, whether it will go down without hiccups in a certain direction. So they get a message from events like this that, look, it is headed in a certain direction and they need to all contribute to that process, including if they have to give approvals for high technology releases. So I think that is important. Going beyond that, as you mentioned, the organizers have taken very determined steps to get congressmen, both Democratic, Republican and senators to be present at the event, to signal the bipartisan nature of the event. And they had done that also in San Jose and in New York, that the representation was from both parties. So, yes, there will be an internal political dimension in terms of outreach to the Indian American community, in terms of votes, in terms of funding that happens. But I think that has to be taken as the collateral. But whether or not the election is far or close, if the U.S. president is coming, you welcome that. Because when the U.S. is seen as behind the interests of a particular country, it helps tremendously. And if you, for example, Israel has been able to pursue its interests in West Asia, because there is a sense the United States is heavily behind Israel. So I think through our economic and other relations, and including through the presence of the Indian origin community, if we are able to leverage more and more U.S. interest in favor of Indian interests, that's something we have to work for.
Sure. Professor Pant, your take on the bipartisan invitation guest list, so to speak, and the holding of this event close to the American election, and also does it indicate to your mind that it's the coming of age of the Indian Americans in the U.S., that they've grown as a constituency politically, economically, and they've become a force reckoned with in U.S. domestic politics?
Absolutely, and I think ever since the U.S.-India nuclear deal, we have seen a great degree of consolidation of this very important resource that India has in the U.S. And this is a community that is, one of the most educated, one of the wealthiest in the country, and very politically aware and politically conscious and want to play a larger political role. And so far, I think they were a bit subdued because perhaps there was also something that was lacking from Delhi. So now, if you have a prime minister as dynamic as Mr. Modi, who wants to leverage Indian diaspora, and I think Indian diaspora is paying him back in ways that we have not seen in the past. So clearly, I think and one of the big angles in this issue has always been that, look, Mr. Trump is also going there for a reason. After all, he also wants to quote this big Indian diaspora. Indian Americans traditionally have voted for Democrats. They have not voted Republican. So clearly there is a political angle there for Mr. Trump, but also for others. And, as we have noted, there is a clear representation across the board, across the aisle, two aisles of the political divide in the country. And that is reflected. And I think successive Indian governments over the last decade or more have been very careful in terms of reaching out to both Democrats and Republicans. And that has been a success of Indian diplomacy over the last few years. You could not have had the kind of achievements India has had in its relationship with the US, with only one party being the target. Yeah. And, we often forget, this was just less than 4 years back, you would have Mr. Obama, who was being quoted by Mr. Modi with equal zeal, and people would say, oh, there's a bromance between Modi and Obama. So I think, we tend to get caught up in the optics of today and here and now, whereas I think the relationship between states evolve over a period. Absolutely. And India has played this diplomatic game quite effectively.
Right. Arun Singh wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to supplement what Professor Pant said with a couple of points. That when any new immigrant community have come in the United States historically, in the beginning they have been on the margins and gradually they have mainstreamed themselves. So for example, when people came to the US from Ireland, they were seen as marginal. Later they came from Greece, they were seen as marginal. When they came from Italy, they were seen as marginal to the mainstream community.
Right.
Over time, as their strength grew, they have been mainstreamed and they're seen very much fully as American and not as coming from another country. So I think the Indian American community is now going through that phase in terms of their numbers, in terms of the decades of their presence in the US. They were a new community, they were a marginal community, and the kind of role they are playing and the kind of assertion that is now happening, with that there will be more and more sort of an integration, a mainstreaming of the Indian American community in US politics, and all this is a part of that effort. The second thing I wanted to mention is that for a long time India-US relations were complex. There were differences between the two countries, and at that time it was a little awkward for the Indian American community in the US to relate very publicly within the United States in terms of India's interests, because between the two countries there were tremendous differences. But now two things happen. US-India relations have improved, and therefore it makes it easier for them to work for the consolidation of that relationship. And India has emerged, because for a long time India was seen as a country having a lot of problems, with a large number of people living in poverty, economy not doing well. So the community was not enthused the same way about contributing to processes between US and India. But now that India is seen as having tremendous economic opportunity, the country doing well, growing despite some of the recent challenges that people are talking about, then they're able to relate more enthusiastically to India and the US-India relationship. Right. Because another thing we have to keep in mind, that although there are from India, the Indian Americans, large number of them would be American passport holders. And they're Americans. Therefore, they cannot do advocacy for India. True. They have to do advocacy for the United States. And their advocacy has to be that what they are suggesting for US interest is also working for India's interest. Sure. And a stronger US-India partnership is in US interest, and that's the way they will be able to advance this process.
All right, if I can just take a moment to remind our viewers that you are watching the continuous coverage here on WION World is One of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Howdy Modi event in Houston, Texas. These are the latest visuals coming to you from inside the NRG Stadium in Houston. We are standing by for the much anticipated public address by Prime Minister Modi and President Trump in Houston, Texas. But if I can just go back to my guests one more time on this discussion before I go to my colleague in New York, Siddhant Sibal. Professor Pant, Ambassador Singh alluded to the differences or the evolution of India-US ties since 2014 in particular. So if I were to take you back to Prime Minister Modi's first visit to the US, when he said in the Congress that India has overcome the hesitations of history. In your estimation, looking ahead and especially over the last 5 odd years, has Washington overcome the hesitation of history in particular in terms of adding a strategic heft to the bilateral ties?
I would say yes. I think there has been a significant shift in the way America now looks at India, and we have actually this shift, if you go back to George W. Bush administration, started happening then. The moment you dehyphenated India with Pakistan and you started looking India as being part of this larger geopolitical matrix, then it was not Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific. And I think that shifted the goalposts and that shifted the narrative. So once you started looking at India as an important pillar in managing regional and global balance of power, you immediately started re-evaluating what India brings to the table. So before it used to be Pakistan, Kashmir, oh my God, there is a nuclear crisis brewing, and even Bill Clinton said Kashmir, there is such a flashpoint, biggest dangerous nuclear flashpoint in the face of the earth. But the moment George W. Bush started looking at it, that administration started looking at India differently, you saw what benefits Indo-US relationship actually could manage out of that. So it was, first came the nuclear deal, then we have seen the defense engagement burgeoning, then we have seen a gradual going away or convergence in the strategic engagement. So I think there is a larger arc of this relationship that has moved, and America certainly has evolved. There used to be a time when American bureaucracy was very resistant to a lot of this shift, and I think successive American presidents have moved the needle on that. And you have now, as Ambassador was pointing out, the moment you have presidents who are invested in this relationship, bureaucracy tends to move. And I think that has been a major shift in the way we have looked at this relationship. And therefore, the reason why Prime Minister invests so much in these leadership level engagements, because there is something you gain out of that, because the larger relationship is favored because you have a leader that is invested in the relationship. And I think that arc needs to be appreciated here in India as well, that we have seen that arc being shifted. And I think the statement that you said was a profound statement, that even in India there are still people in India who would say, my God, America not to be trusted, there is a Cold War. Certainly there are people who have that historical, that evolution of the relationship is still there. Right. But I think we have to look at where we are today from where we were in 2 decades back. And that is a remarkable transformation for any bilateral relationship to make. And that could not have been possible without both the sides equally invested in the relationship. Sure.
All right, before I can go across to my colleague Siddhant Sibal in New York, Ambassador Singh, you wanted to come in very quickly? Yeah.
Very quickly, just to say, as Professor Pant mentioned, both sides are making an attempt to overcome the hesitations of history. And President Bush doing the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement was a major break from the past, because through that agreement, the US made an exception for India from technology denial regimes it had created to target India. So that was the major step. And following from that, President Obama declared India as a major defense partner. President Trump has put India as strategic trade authorization level 1. True. And India has followed up by signing many defense cooperation agreements with the US. So I think both countries are making that attempt.
All right, Siddhant, we're discussing about the Trump-Modi bromance, so to speak, and according to reports, this is the largest gathering ever for any foreign leader visiting the US other than the Pope. So it's a big-ticket event and a lot in store for the India-US ties going forward, given the choice of President Trump to grace the venue of Howdy Modi in Houston, Texas.
Well, of course, the place of venue is symbolic given the large number of Indians present in Houston. But this is the largest gathering for any visiting foreign leader who is democratically elected leader as well. So it's a strong message, a message of growing closeness between the largest and the oldest democracy of the world. And of course, a message when it comes to the Indian American community. If I talk about the Indian American community, this is a community. This is a small community, but has played a vital role in the American society. It has the lowest poverty levels among all the groups here in America. And if we look at their background, they have played an important role when it comes to the economic role. There are Chatwas, and of course, when we come to the politics, we know there are so many names who in fact are the contenders of presidential elections in 2020. So that is why this is a tribute to the Indian community, the rising power of the Indian community, the influence of the Indian community. And today is that blockbuster Sunday when the celebrations happen when it comes to India-US ties, and of course the Indian community who have played an important role. In fact, last week saw two important briefings. First, of course, by the External Affairs Minister and then by the Foreign Secretary on the visit of the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And questions were asked about the visit, and one thing they had to say that the fact that the US President is present in a diaspora event along with the Indian Prime Minister says much about the role the Indian community has played in the entire society, in the development of society here in America. Right now I'm standing at the Times Square, and we do expect a lot of people to be here as well, but we do expect right now, even as we speak, gathering has started in New Jersey, which is just nearby, where a lot of Indians will be present, and in fact big screens are being put up even as we speak to make sure that people can watch the entire Howdy Modi speech by the Indian Prime Minister and the US President Donald Trump, which is a kind of rare occasion for a Donald Trump to speak along with a foreign leader at a diaspora event. So clearly a message, a symbolism that will be heard from Washington to New Delhi, from New Delhi to New York, where I am standing, and a message of growing camaraderie and convergences between the largest and the oldest democracy.
Indeed, and a quick word from you, Siddhant, on Prime Minister Modi's meeting with the Indian diaspora in Houston, especially the Kashmiri pandit community, who have come out openly in support of India's moves in Jammu and Kashmir. They've supported the abrogation of Article 370. And contrast this with the maneuvers by the Pakistani government and the Pakistani establishment in whipping up tensions and whipping up sentiments on this particular issue in UN, especially the UN forum. Now, given the fact that the Indian envoy to the UN, Syed Akbuddin, has said in no uncertain terms that when they go low, we go high. So what can we expect going forward on this issue, especially given the fact that you are in New York and the UNGA will meet on this issue very soon?
Well, when it comes to the Kashmiri community, in fact, it was one of the key engagements, the first engagements after, of course, his meeting with the CEOs of energy majors in the United States. He met with the Kashmiri community, the Kashmiri Pandit community in Houston, and he will be getting a strong welcome by the Kashmiri community, Kashmiri Pandit community here in New York. I just spoke to a few Kashmiri Pandits, and they told me that they're going to gather in front of the hotel where Prime Minister is staying and will be giving him a rousing welcome. And it seems not by design but by choice that the Indian Prime Minister is meeting the Kashmiri Pandit community. A message is being sent, a message to, of course, to one country in our neighborhood that is keen to create mess and continue with the same old rant which they have continued for last 70 years. In fact, yes, we all know that they are also planning something, but this is usual and routine when it comes to that camp, the Pakistani camp of organizing such events. And the Foreign Secretary, in response to a question when asked if there can be problems, he clearly said that we know we have full confidence in the American authorities that there will be no untoward event. And by and large, this is a story about celebration of India-US ties, and clearly that country is not featuring anywhere.
All right, on that note, Siddhant Sibal in New York, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on Howdy Modi and India's engagements in the US in the days ahead. I want to tell our viewers about the pictures coming in, those of students who are welcoming Prime Minister Modi. Take a look.
Howdy Modi, welcome to the USA from NRG Stadium. We are the Vanderbilt High School legacies from Austin, Texas, and we approve this message and give consent to use it.
All right, time for a very short break here on WION World is One. Keep watching our continuous coverage of Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US, and we are counting down to the much anticipated event, Howdy Modi, in Houston, Texas. Don't go anywhere.